because I think that even though we all hated 7th grade biology, if we look at the biochemistry of sugar a little bit, it will help you understand why sugar is so bad. This is a molecule of sucrose, like sugar. And sucrose contains 1 glucose molecule and 1 fructose molecule. Okay? Now, if you look at like a long chain, you know, like a complex carbohydrate, let's say like beans or vegetables, you know, or something like that, they're mostly glucose molecules, 6-sided sugars next to each other. Okay? Now, for every molecule of glucose, you produce 36 ATP. Okay? Now, ATP is adenosine triphosphate, but it's what the body uses for energy. Everyone remember that? Does this all ring a bell? The Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation, and all that stuff, right? So ATP, 36 ATP per glucose molecule. Fructose, okay, makes 2 ATP and fat, okay? Now, in 1960, Americans averaged 60 pounds of sugar per person in the 1960s. Americans now average about 150 pounds of sugar per person, okay? So what happens when you get a large percentage of your calories from sugar is you're tired all the time. Because it's a small molecule, you get rapid uptake of it, so you feel really energized quickly, but then you go right to sleep, right? Because you get tired because you can't produce any energy. You're just producing fat. So, and that's why we're all like fat and tired. You know, it's because we're eating too much sugar. You know? I mean, it's not that complex. Plus what happens, fructose indirectly, and I'll get to this in a minute, prevents the signaling to our brain to tell us that we've had enough to eat. So you keep eating when you eat sugar. You don't get the signal to stop. Okay? And then if you took like just a long chain carbohydrate and took 2 glucose molecules, you get obviously 72 ATP. Okay? So, I mean, that's why complex carbohydrates are better for energy than is sugar. Okay? And by the way, I think the original Gatorade was a glucose solution. It wasn't a glucose fructose, it wasn't a sugar solution, but when they went to make it commercially, no one liked the way it tasted. So it was really a pretty good product when it originally came out, you know, but it was really just a sports drink. Okay? Does everyone understand that? Now do you understand why sugar is bad? I mean, and here's the other thing, is that regular cane sugar is 50-50, 1 glucose and 1 fructose molecule. High fructose corn syrup is basically 60% fructose, 40% glucose. So you're having more fructose in high fructose corn syrup, and it's cheaper and it's sweeter, okay? Which also makes the addiction worse, because sugar acts just like a drug. It has all the properties of an addictive drug. You know, if you take a little bit of it, you feel good. If you then you don't feel as good after you have more. You have to have more to get sort of feel the same way. You know, that sort of feeling. Then if you stop it, you get withdrawal symptoms. All those things are symptoms of drug addiction. You know, so sugar creates the same thing. So think of sugar as a drug that's bad for you. I mean, that's one way to not eat as much of it. Okay? Fat is an organ with hormones. When we get fat, what happens is these hormones don't operate correctly, right? So you have leptin and adiponectin are the 2 hormones that are in fat. And what happens is fructose causes leptin resistance, and leptin's what sends the signal to the brain to stop eating. Okay? So what happens is when you become obese, the signaling doesn't work correctly. And so you don't get the normal feedback mechanism. So what happens when this happens, you actually have to cut out sugar. You have to be more aggressive in making changes than if you're just trying to lose a little bit of weight if you need to lose a lot of weight, because you've got to reset the mechanisms. So what diseases are associated with insulin resistance? Well, pretty much everything I see people for, except for the respiratory stuff. Of course, asthma isn't, allergies aren't, but you know, a lot of things that we see people for in the office have some connection to insulin resistance. Okay? And that's why it's so important to address. Calorie restriction is interesting. What's interesting about calorie restriction, during World War II, the incidence of heart disease went down 50% in Europe. People were dying from other things, but the incidence of heart disease went down 50% because there wasn't enough to eat. Okay? And when you look at long-lived societies, what you see is they average about 15 to 100 calories per day. And they're exercising. Okay? Americans average 3,000. There's also evidence that calorie restriction may upregulate the sirtuin enzyme, which may decrease inflammation. That's questionable at this point. What's really interesting are the animal studies. Okay? There's some studies like in mice where they actually calorie-restricted mice. Now keep in mind, mice are not fed burgers and fries. Okay? Mice are fed mice chow. But when you calorie restrict a mouse prepubescent, before it reaches puberty, they live 50% longer. Okay? When you calorie restrict a mouse by 25% after puberty, they live 20% longer. Okay? And that to me is very scary information when I know now that the pediatric population, 26% is obese. So that is a scary thing because that means that some of these patterns, these inflammatory patterns, are set in childhood, if that holds, which it may or may not. This study in monkeys was also very interesting, where they noticed when they calorie restricted monkeys versus the ones they didn't calorie restrict, a 300% relative risk reduction of all-cause mortality. That's pretty impressive. Boy, if there were a pill that would reduce someone's relative risk of dying from everything by 300%, I mean, would you take it? If it had no side effects? I think I would, So anxiety also plays a role. Surprisingly, and this shouldn't surprise people, anxiety causes insulin resistance. Big surprise, because you're sort of getting the trend of where this talk is going. And what's also interesting is happier people have healthier immune systems. Happier people actually have higher levels of what's called secretory IgA, which is an immunoglobulin which helps prevent upper respiratory infections. So really, if you're happier, you are healthier. You can clap your hands, I guess. And then what we also know is chronic psychological trauma also can cause shrinking of the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's also associated with increased cortisol secretion and insulin resistance. The other thing I think that's important to understand is this fight or flight phenomenon that we have. We're designed to react. We have this fight or flight. If we encounter like let's say like a saber-toothed tiger and you had a spear, you had to make a decision. Do you run or do you fight? Okay? But the problem is we can't determine between a real threat and a perceived threat. Our brains aren't developed that way. So when you're listening to a 24-hour news cycle where it's telling you the world is going to end, and you're listening to people are marketing to you that if you don't get this car, if you this is the safest car, or you don't have this car seat, your child's going to die, or if this, I mean, it's not healthy, because fear is used as a marketing tool. And so that creates chronic stress. Or if you're working 11 hours a day, if you're working hard and are under stress all the time, that's not healthy. The study showing that if you work, stress associated with working more than 11 hours per day increased relative risk of a coronary event by 77%. Okay? You know what smoking, the relative risk of increasing a heart attack from smoking is? 100%. So it's pretty close. It's I think it's somewhere between 1.8 to 2.0 versus 1.77. I mean, that's like the same, right? So stress really is an important risk factor that we all need to address. Now, on the other hand, exercise is good. Exercise is a good thing because it does lots of positive effects. It decreases insulin resistance, it improves mood, it improves our adrenal reserves. And the interesting thing about exercise that I want to talk about is this concept of coronary artery remodeling. Anyone know what that is? Well, what we found is if this is a coronary artery, unfortunately they had a red magic marker, and this is plaque, okay? And we know the rupture of soft plaque is what causes heart attacks, right? We're agreed on that. That's what causes heart attacks. Okay? So statin drugs, the reason why statin drugs are so effective is they stabilize plaque. It's not because they lower cholesterol. It's because they stabilize plaque and they prevent its rupture. Okay? But if you combine that with diet and exercise, what exercise does is cause remodeling. It can actually increase the size of the lumen from that pressure of blood going through there. So the artery actually gets bigger. So when you go and do an angiogram, you know, and send dye through there, it looks like the plaque has gone away. But it really hasn't. It's just that the arteries increased in size. So exercise, statin drugs, and diet are extremely important to anyone that has a history of any heart disease. Now, chemical loads I just want to talk about briefly, because I don't want to scare you, because I just put on the anxiety slide about how I'm not supposed to scare you. Right? Okay. But I'm just going to talk about it briefly, and I think one of the things that I think is important is to understand this concept of the precautionary principle. What the precautionary principle states is basically that something should not be introduced into society until it's proven safe. Okay? And basically in Europe, I think a couple years ago, they sort of adopted this model for introduction of new chemicals. Okay? That's not how we do things in this country. In this country, what we do is we look at what's thought to be the safest allowable level of a chemical. Okay? And we don't look at all chemicals, we only look at each chemical individually, so we're not looking at what is the simultaneous effect of multiple exposures, you know, for chemicals. We don't know. There's no data. The EPA wanted to do a study for the, you know, pediatricians encouraged the EPA to do a study. They decided they'd have to give it up because they thought they would have to withdraw all the chemicals off the market. You know, they were concerned. This was done in California a while ago. So they never did the study. So we don't know the impact of multiple low-level exposures. The other thing that I think is important is to understand that when these things are looked at, all the studies remain the property of the business that's submitting the study, right? So none of it's available if something's approved for public scrutiny, right, afterwards. The same thing is true of genetically modified foods, you know, which are around. You notice how there's no truth in labeling in genetically modified foods? You have no idea what they are, right? Well, I'll tell you what they are. It's all corn, it's virtually all soybeans, it's all canola, you know, so canola oil is genetically modified, and it's anything with cottonseed oil in it. So unless it's an organic soybean, it's genetically modified, okay? And no one really knows what the impact of these type of products is on anyone. And I just put this up just to let you know there is some data suggesting that chemicals do have an impact on our health. You know, and that a lot of these chemicals from the post-baby boomer era, you know, because remember, the EPA didn't even come into existence until the 1970s, I believe, right? So for those of us that were baby boomers and born after 1944, you know, there was a huge influx of petrochemicals into society, of which were really unregulated, and there's still residues of some of these today. We also know that increased levels of volatile organic chemicals are associated with insulin resistance, you know, if you look in the urine, because those things are stored in fat. And there's some other things with plasticizers, which are thought to be endocrine disruptors, you know. But again, I don't really want to make that the main topic. This is a topic unto itself. But I think it's something that we don't spend enough time looking at and really need to spend a lot more time looking at on what the impact of all these products is on our health. So where do we go from here? What does the literature show? You know, well, this was a study done called the HALE study, Health and Aging and Longevity in Europeans. It was done 2004, Journal of the American Medical Association. So that's not really an alternative medicine journal. That's really a mainstream medical journal. I think we can all agree on that. And what this study showed, it looked at people ages 70 to 90 in Europeans, therefore health and aging, longevity in Europeans. And they took people from Northern Europe, who were primarily from Denmark and Germany, and they switched them to a Southern Mediterranean diet, which was a diet high in vegetables, legumes, with some fish, and had them exercise 30 minutes a day and allowed moderate alcohol consumption.